All right, Ryan, what's on your radar?
So the fight over the filibuster is inextricably bound up with the infrastructure debate. But people in Washington so far are extremely confused about what its role has really been. This matters because this misunderstanding is shaping the way some Democrats are starting to think about it. So let's walk through what people are getting wrong. If you listen to the bipartisan pack of Senate negotiators who struck the infrastructure bargain, their work proves that the Senate can still work without getting rid of the filibuster.
At a time when Washington seems broken, this group of members behind me came together, along with others, and decided we were going to do something great for our country. Every American believes that roads and bridges, ports and waterways, even our digital infrastructure needs to be updated. They know it because they travel on those roads, go to those bridges, deal with the challenges of not having Wi-Fi to be able to do your schoolwork or your work or get your health care. So people know that it's needed.
And they even look like they like each other.
Well, Susan Collins, in the last 24 hours, I think has slept maybe 2 hours.
But she looks great.
She looks great.
So these negotiators were quite explicit in telling us that a primary reason they wanted to make this deal bipartisan was to prove that the system worked.
It came not so much because folks were interested in their bridge or their road or their piece of the middle mile of broadband, but because each of us are deeply committed to demonstrating to the country and to the world that our government can work, and it can work for the people of the United States of America.
But that also means, conveniently for Republicans and Democrats who don't want to pass voting rights legislation, that they can just leave the filibuster in place and throw up their hands. And they can talk about how sad it is that they just couldn't do it this time. But the whole premise is flawed. The bipartisan deal didn't get struck thanks to the filibuster. It didn't get struck because the system still works. It came together because a quirk in the legislative process known as reconciliation was there, which let some legislation pass with just 50 votes. That put Republicans up against a wall. In other words, the deal got struck because if it fell apart, Democrats could move everything they needed through reconciliation, which can't be filibustered. The fact that something was going to get passed, no matter what Republicans did, motivated those Republicans to actually make a deal. If their real choice was that they could either work with Democrats and pass something, or they could blow it up, they'd choose to blow it up every time and twice on Sunday. But that third option, that Democrats could just go it alone, is what forced them to play ball. And without the reconciliation option, progressives in the House and Senate would never have agreed to allow the bipartisan bill through, instead demanding something bigger. So let's be really clear about this, since so many people seem confused. It was the possibility of passing the deal by a simple majority that forced Republicans to compromise. And it's not just Republicans. In 2017, when Trump and McConnell passed their tax cut using reconciliation, Joe Manchin compromised with them. He negotiated with Republicans, and he was about to support it until McConnell ditched him at the very last minute because he didn't need his vote. For a long time, advocates of reforming the filibuster have argued that the 60-vote threshold doesn't encourage bipartisanship. It actually gets in the way of doing legislation. If a party can stop something, they'll always prefer that to working with the other party to do something. This filibuster deal proves that theory was correct. So if Democrats leave the filibuster in place, we'll have a Senate that can negotiate effectively a few times a year, but only over things that can go into reconciliation, like infrastructure spending or tax cuts. Everything else won't have a chance. In that everything else bucket is voting rights. Negotiations over the voting rights bill have been going on in earnest in the background, even as Biden has effectively given up on it. On Friday, Schumer and Pelosi were at the White House for talks ahead of a final push. Some of the bill, interestingly, can go through by reconciliation. Now, I get that Schumer has good reason the past few weeks not to make a stink about voting rights in the filibuster while these delicate, multi-trillion-dollar talks have been going on. The party has clearly prioritized that ahead of the voting rights bill. Congress probably won't finish the two-track infrastructure plan until September. In August, the census is supposed to release its new population numbers, which then triggers the redistricting process. The voting rights bill bans gerrymandering, requiring independent commissions instead, but if it's not in place by August, it's hard to see that being implemented in time for the 2022 elections. But there are other important components of the legislation, and come September, Democrats will have another chance to pass it, but only if they reform the filibuster. By then, it will be abundantly clear that there aren't 10 Republicans willing to go along with it. And it should also be clear to everyone that the only reason this bipartisan infrastructure bill passed is because an alternative package couldn't be filibustered. So Democrats, don't get all up in your fuzzy feelings about bipartisanship and think that the filibuster did something good. It didn't. Something good happened because there was the chance to go around the filibuster. Get rid of the filibuster and do some more good. So Kim, do you think people are going to actually absorb the real lesson that it was a majority vote threshold that allowed this deal to come through? Because it forced Republicans to realize, oh, this train is leaving the station. I can either get a seat or I can watch it leave on its own.
Yeah. I mean, listen, you make a great argument for getting rid of the filibuster. I think that there is something there to say, hey, listen, these guys are, if they're under threat and they realize that a simple majority is just going to pass legislation, then it would force more of this sort of bipartisan get together. I guess we have to do something, get something in there or else. I think there's a great argument to be made there. I think the real fear that now some people just say, no, this would get rid of age-old ways of doing things, and conservatives don't really like change. But one of my reasons for fearing getting rid of the filibuster is really just the tyranny. I really am afraid of the tyranny of the majority. I think that we see if there is a really tyrannical majority that they will just railroad through the things that they want, and they won't actually sit down with the other side when the other side is sitting there saying, we're really worried about this and we need to come together. I mean, that's kind of my fear on the whole thing. But I think you do make a really good argument.
Yeah, I mean, there's always going to be a downside with any legislative tweaks that you make in a system where you have a kind of rising authoritarianism on one side. But what I would argue is that if Republicans and a Trump or a neo-Trump, come into power and really do want to move something through, it's not going to be their reticence over reforming filibuster rules that slows them down. It's not as if there is some ironclad law in place that is going to block them from getting rid of the filibuster if they decide that they want to do it. Trump, tried very hard to get rid of the filibuster, and only because a few Republicans kind of stood in his way did he not do it. But this was in a period of transition where you had the old Republican Party kind of transitioning into the Trump Republican Party. I don't think in a future situation where you have a Trump or a Trump-like president that you would have those handful of votes, blocking, because you only need 50 to get rid of a filibuster. And if you remember, Lindsey Graham was one of those people who late 2016, early 2017 said, no way am I getting rid of the filibuster. Does anybody believe today that same person, that Lindsey Graham, would tell Trump no on that?
All I know is that whenever liberals make changes, it comes back to bite them. And because, conservatives, they're less likely to make those sorts of changes. That's why we did see, even though Trump was calling for this change, some of the old guard Republicans said, no, we can't make changes to things that we've had for a long time. That was Mitch McConnell there for you. But, what happens is that Democrats make the changes anyway, and then Republicans come back and say, you're going to regret this. And they do. They ultimately regret it because Republicans unleash it. And when they do it 10 times harder. So, I think there would be a lot of legislation rammed through if there was a simple Republican majority, and that would be very, very frightening, I think, for many people.
Yeah. Although the one last point is that what's kind of asymmetric about this whole thing is that Republican legislation, almost all of it that they want to do, can go through reconciliation because it's around tax cuts and it's around spending. And so they already sort of have a simple majority by which they can by which they can pass most of their agenda, whereas Democrats want to actually pass constructive legislation, which requires 60 votes. And the history so far is that in 2013, Democrats got rid of the filibuster for cabinet appointments and for judges underneath the Supreme Court level, and then they started moving through the judges. When McConnell took over in 2017, instantly he got rid of it to put Neil Gorsuch onto the Supreme Court.
Right, but that's what I mean. They made it bigger.
But it was McConnell, right? It was McConnell who got rid of that, showing that if Democrats had not gotten rid of the filibuster in 2013, there's no world in which McConnell in 2017, after blocking Merrick Garland for an entire year from getting onto the Supreme Court, says, well, we'd really like this Federalist Society approved Neil Gorsuch, but it's unfortunate there's a filibuster in place and Democrats kept it, so we're not going to get rid of it. So he would have gotten rid of it, and I think that Republicans will if Democrats do. It's not a question of if, it's a question of when. But Kim, I am looking forward to seeing what's on your radar up next.